Okay, so next up is Adam Winsche. Adam is a PhD student in political science, studying comparative politics and international relations. He is also a contributing analyst for the online consultancy firm Wikistrat. Adam graduated high school early in small-town North Idaho so he could quickly join the U.S. Army. He completed 5 years with the U.S. Army after receiving the rank of sergeant and completing 2 deployments in Afghanistan. His dissertation focuses on armed state-building operations like those in Afghanistan and their frequent inability to produce stable democracies. Please help me welcome Adam with his talk, Would You Intervene? Dilemmas of Armed State Building.
This is what remains of the Syrian city of Aleppo. Just try to take a moment to take this all in. Since the war began there 6 years ago, 500,000 Syrians have lost their lives. 5 million have left the country as refugees, and another 6 million have been displaced from their homes. Chemical weapons has been used on both sides, and both sides have been accused of war crimes. And the worst thing is that there's no end in sight. Both sides have foreign backers, and the opposition is so divided that a negotiated settlement is almost impossible. But some potential good news is that if the full force of the American military might was deployed to this country, that war could be over in a matter of weeks, maybe months, instead of years, maybe decades. Other problems that come from this conflict could also be ended. The only reason that the Islamic State holds territory is because Iraq and Syria failed to do so. And so I'm going to start this talk with a simple question for all of you. It's participatory, so you can, if you were the President of the United States and you had the ability to end this conflict, to end the humanitarian crisis unlike we've seen in a long time, would you do it? Show of hands. Anybody? All right. Healthy bit of cynicism there. I like it. So that's the question, and that's what I want you to think about throughout this talk, okay? Would you intervene in Syria? And as we're thinking about that, you should know that winning the war isn't enough. You can't just win the war. You also have to win the peace afterwards. So we can't just go in, proclaim mission accomplished and leave. We also have to win the peace that comes after it. And Syria isn't alone. We have humanitarian crises going on all over the world. These are fragile and failed states across the world, and they have similar problems throughout them. These are some of the problems, refugees. So not only in the countries that they come from, as that on the side on the left there is where they're coming from, but also these countries that you see on the right. These countries have to absorb these refugees that comes with political, economic, and social strains on these countries that some can't even handle. These are UN missions around the world, and so these are the attempts to win that peace. So you can see that the UN map there on the side of UN missions correlates pretty closely to that map of failed and fragile states. And you can see since the 1990s, these missions have been increasing significantly since then. The problem is that we're not very good at that. We're not very good at winning the peace. As the years go on, we seem to get worse and worse at counterinsurgency operations, worse and worse at occupations, and worse at state-building operations. If you are to win the peace, there's a lot that you need to do. You can't just, win the military conflict, right? So you have to build a state that can deliver goods. You need to build a security force that can secure the territory, both externally and internally. You have to build the economy back up after years of disrepair and destruction. And so we've been really bad at winning the peace. And there's a reason for that. These interveners that get into these state-building operations are stuck between a rock and a hard place. They face dilemmas on a significant scale, and there's many of them. There's not just one or two of these dilemmas that they face. There's lots of dilemmas. And that means that a certain policy that you institute to try to solve a problem or solve this problem may create another problem altogether, or it may undermine the operation altogether. So what I'm going to do is talk about just 3 of those dilemmas. These are only 3. There's entire books written about how many dilemmas there are in these operations. One of them is the footprint and duration dilemma. So these are both kind of related. It says that you are more likely to succeed in these operations if you have more troops and you stay there for a longer time, right? So if you have more people there securing the territory and you stay there for a longer period of time, you're more likely to succeed. The problem is that the more troops and the longer you stay there, the more likely you are to incite resentment in the population that you're trying to police. And so that kind of backfires on the whole situation. If you're not seen as legitimate, it's unlikely that you'll be able to secure the population. So this is a picture from Somalia. We went in there and tried to solve for this dilemma by having a small footprint and staying there for a very short amount of time. But that was obviously problematic. And not only did we do that, but we came up with a credible exit strategy and said when we were going to leave, hoping that that would reduce resentment. The only thing that that did is give a cue to the militias that that's the point that they need to just lay low until, and then they can go after the much lighter armed UN humanitarian operations. And Somalia today remains a failed state. Regime change dilemma. Usually one of the big reasons that you're going into these countries is that the regime that's there isn't doing so well. So usually when you go into these countries, what you want to do is remove that regime and replace it with something that's more legitimate and more just. The problem is, and especially in the case in Iraq, they had a specific policy of excluding as many people from government as possible. And so when you go into this country and remove all of the Ba'athist Party members, you're essentially excluding everybody that has experience in governing from government. And so the people who are coming in, who are allowed to come in, don't have any experience, and you have a government that's extremely inefficient in doing the things that it needs to do, securing the population and delivering goods. And in a particular case in Iraq, it was specifically used as a sectarian tool to purge the government of the Sunni minority. And sectarian conflict remains a problem for Iraq today and probably for a long time in the future. The foreign aid dilemma. So usually these countries that you're going into, they've been underdeveloped for a long time. They've experienced years of conflict, and so you want to build up that infrastructure, and you want to build up that economy again. And so you dump foreign money into the country in the hopes of building it back up. The problem is that a lot of these countries can't absorb large amounts of money when they do come in. So there's an example in Afghanistan. This is a natural gas station in Afghanistan, and it overwent its budget by so much that at the end it cost over $1 billion. And nobody seemed to think about checking whether or not Afghans drove cars that drive on natural gas. Turns out not a lot. So not only did it go over, but it was also extremely useless in the country. And there's a lot of other problems that come along with that. Agencies don't have the manpower in the country to run these agencies effectively, and so they bring in foreigners, but when those foreigners leave, you're back to square one where you don't have people to staff these agencies. Afghanistan, as you know, remains a failed state today. Now, if you remember from my bio, I actually participated in one of these conflicts. Don't tell my mom I wasn't wearing a helmet. And for me, these conflicts and these interventions take on a much more personal element for me. I think it's easy for us to lose that personal side of these interventions when we're talking about what is the national interest, are we concerned about this country or not. It's easy to forget that these interventions impact those populations to a significant scale on the individual level. I can say firsthand that Afghanistan was one of the most beautiful countries that I've ever been to. Both landscape and people living in the landscape it was incredible. And I grew up in the Rockies, so being around mountains like this it felt somewhat at home to me, at least in terms of landscape. And so for a lot of these people, the intervention is working out quite well for them. We called this guy Mr. GQ. It's pretty fashionable for rural Afghanistan. But the intervention doesn't touch everybody equally. Some people don't experience the benefits of all this economic development and the intervention itself. So we need to remember that, it's complicated, basically. So imagine what this little girl's life would have been like had we not overthrown the Taliban. The differences in her life, making that simple decision of intervening is significant and almost impossible to imagine how different those two situations would be. But it's not always positive. This man standing on the wall behind me was an interpreter for our unit, and about 2 months before I left country, he stopped showing up to work. We tried to find him, couldn't. Most likely scenario was that he was kidnapped, tortured, and killed by the Taliban. So it's important to understand, the personal stories that's going on here, but to also remember that, it's extremely complicated. One more story before I ask you the question again. In 2011, when the Syrian war kicked off, the Obama administration was considering options of what they could do to intervene, how they could intervene, what they could do to positively impact that conflict. He was considering arming and training rebels. And so he went to the CIA and asked them, when we do this kind of operation, how often do we succeed? And the response back was almost never. Almost never do we succeed when we arm and train rebels. But he decided to do it anyways. And so it's important to think about that. Why, after being told that it almost never succeeds, did he still decide to do it? The cost of doing nothing can be significant. In Rwanda, we decided to do nothing, and there was a genocide. But the cost of doing a lot can also be catastrophic. We did a lot in Iraq, and the consequences of that were catastrophic as well. But the consequences of doing a little bit can also be catastrophic. So the question, would you intervene in Syria? Thank you.